A single invoice broke a 6-year laundering operation. 900 aluminum bats, 62 players on the roster. The math didn't work, and one financial analyst in Tucson couldn't stop looking at it. On the surface, the Academia Halcones de Cajeme looked like a gift to a hard-luck neighborhood in Ciudad Obregón, Sonora. 2 manicured diamonds, sponsored jerseys in blue and gold, a pipeline that had already sent a handful of teenage shortstops to open tryouts across the border in Arizona. Parents paid nothing, not for gloves, not for cleats, not for the bus rides to weekend tournaments. In a region where a decent bat costs more than a week's wages at the maquiladora, that kind of generosity gets noticed. It gets thanked. It does not get questioned. That was the design. Drive through Cajeme municipality on a Saturday morning during tournament season, and you'd see exactly what you were meant to see. Folding chairs lined up 3 deep along the first baseline. Grandmothers selling elote from coolers. A scoreboard that actually worked, which in a town where half the streetlights had been out for 2 years, said something on its own. Kids in matching uniforms that fit, that didn't have another boy's name stitched over the chest from a hand-me-down season. The academy had built something that felt, to everyone standing inside it, like proof that somebody in this town still cared about kids who weren't supposed to have a shot at anything. Look closer, and the details stack up the same way every time. The infield dirt was raked before every practice, not just tournament days. A small, expensive habit that most municipal leagues in the Yaqui Valley simply couldn't afford. The batting cages had real netting, replaced every off-season instead of patched with zip ties like the ones 2 towns over. Even the team buses were newer than anything else on the road in that part of Cajeme. Diesel engines that didn't cough black smoke at every stoplight. None of it, on its own, was suspicious. A well-funded youth program is not a crime. But investigators would later note that the academy's physical footprint had grown roughly 4 times faster than its donor list, and nobody in the town's sports commission had ever asked how. Behind the batting cages and the donor plaques, the academy was something else entirely. A financing engine for a Sinaloa faction moving fentanyl money out of the United States and into legitimate-looking Mexican assets. Investigators would eventually trace roughly $390 million through the operation over 6 years. Not through the bats, through the boosters, the fake gate receipts, and 34 small businesses that had supposedly opened their wallets out of civic pride. And underneath even that, the academy ran a second business nobody put on a scoreboard. It scouted boys not for bat speed, but for something a cartel needs more than power hitters: clean records. Teenagers with no criminal history, no flags, no reason for a border agent at the Nogales port of entry to look twice. The tryouts in Arizona were real, so were the diamonds. That was what made it work. This is the story of how a single equipment order, bats, catcher's gear, $41,000, shipped through a Hermosillo customs broker who kept turning up in the wrong case files, pulled apart a laundering network that had run clean for the better part of a decade. It's also the story of what a DEA financial group in Tucson had to piece together first. Who ran the academy? Who protected it? And why the number that should have been the least interesting detail in the whole file turned out to be the one that mattered. Ciudad Obregón sits in the Yaqui Valley, a farming town built on wheat and cotton money, about 250 miles south of the Arizona line. It's not Culiacan. It's not a city people associate with cartel infrastructure. That was part of the appeal. A youth sports charity in a farm town draws less scrutiny than a warehouse in a city everyone already watches. The academy opened its doors under the direction of a local named Héctor Villalba, a former semi-pro catcher who'd washed out of independent ball in his 20s and come home to coach. On paper, Villalba was exactly what he looked like: a baseball guy who loved kids and had a knack for fundraising. He shook hands at church. He showed up at quinceañeras. He knew which auto shop owner had a kid who could hit and which one just wanted his name on a banner. People trusted him because there was nothing about him that asked to be trusted. He never oversold it. That was the cover working exactly as intended. The Academy's books, when investigators finally got a look at them, showed donations from 34 small businesses around Cajeme Municipality, tire shops, a bottled water bottling plant on the edge of town, 3 tortillerias. None of them large operations. None of them the kind of business that draws a forensic accountant's attention on its own. Together, spread across 3 dozen invoices a month, they built a paper trail that looked like exactly what a beloved community program should look like. I spent a long time going through the pattern DEA analysts eventually reconstructed, and one detail kept nagging at me. The Academy also reported gate receipts from its own tournaments, ticket sales, concession stand revenue, parking, on a youth baseball field with no fences and no ticket booth. Analysts later confirmed some of those tournaments had no recorded attendance at all, no rosters filed with the regional league, no umpires paid, nothing except a number in a ledger claiming the games happened and people came to watch. Money doesn't need spectators. It just needs a line item. The structure was elegant in a grim kind of way. Fentanyl proceeds, cash, and hard to move in bulk across a border already saturated with currency detection dogs and bulk cash statutes, got broken into pieces small enough to look like Tuesday. A tortilleria reports a strong week. A tire shop makes a donation in exchange for a banner over third base. The Academy reports a big gate at a tournament that technically happened, on paper, whether or not a single kid swung a bat that weekend. Multiply that by 3 dozen fronts and 6 years, and you get a river of cash that never once has to explain itself as cartel money, because on every individual receipt, it isn't. That's the part that should unsettle anyone who thinks laundering only happens in casinos and shell banks. Sometimes it happens at a little league field, with your neighbor's name on the scoreboard. There's a woman we'll call Marisol, because the record of her cooperation with investigators remains sealed and her name isn't ours to use. Her son played second base for the Academy's 14 and under squad for 2 seasons. She remembers the day Villalba pulled her aside after practice, not to talk about her son's swing, but to ask, almost offhand, whether her husband had ever had any trouble with the law. She remembers being embarrassed by the question, then relieved when she realized it was for the Arizona tryout paperwork, background forms, Villalba explained, that U.S. scouts required before they'd let a foreign minor onto their field. She filled it out without a second thought. Her husband had a clean record. Of course he did. Everyone in her family did. She wouldn't learn until years later, when investigators finally reached out to her directly, that the question had never been about paperwork for a scout. It had been about her. That's the layer of this case that doesn't show up in a forfeiture filing. A mother answering an innocuous question at a baseball practice, years before anyone in her family understood what the question was actually for. There's another family worth naming here, or not naming, since the court record protects him too. We'll call the boy Ramon. He was 12 when he made the Academy's travel squad, the youngest player ever selected for a cross-border tryout weekend, and by every measure that mattered on the field, he'd earned it. The fastest bat speed his age group had produced in 3 seasons, according to a scouting note investigators later pulled from the Academy's own files. What that scouting note didn't mention, and what a second, separate file did, was a column tracking his stepfather's immigration and criminal history status, updated twice in the 18 months before the tryout, each time after a casual conversation Villalba had with Ramon's mother at pickup. Ramon made the trip. He didn't make the team. Investigators believe now that making the team was never really the point of sending him. The point was learning, cleanly and quietly, that a boy from that household could cross the port of entry at Nogales, sit through secondary screening without incident, and come home the same day without so much as a flagged record. Ramon is 16 now. He still plays. He has no idea his own tryout weekend was, in the language investigators eventually used in an internal memo, a successful test run. 250 miles north, in a DEA field office in Tucson, Arizona, none of this had a name yet. It was a shape in a spreadsheet, and one financial analyst kept finding herself circling back to it. Her name was Elena Reyes, a special agent attached to a financial investigations group that spent most of its time on the unglamorous side of narcotics work: wire transfers, shell company filings, customs manifests. Not raids, not wiretaps in the early going. Reyes had transferred into financial crimes after 4 years working interdiction on the line at Nogales, and she brought something with her that a lot of accountants turned agents don't have. She knew what a legitimate cross-border shipment actually looked like, because she'd stood at the port and watched thousands of them roll through. Colleagues who worked with her in those years describe a habit that bordered on compulsive. Reyes kept her own running spreadsheet, separate from the official case management system, of customs brokers who'd appeared anywhere near a flagged shipment, even brokers cleared of wrongdoing, even brokers who'd shown up on a file that closed without charges. Most agents in her group considered it overkill. Brokers move thousands of shipments a year. Touching one flagged file doesn't make a broker dirty, and chasing every name that crosses a watch list is a good way to burn months on nothing. Reyes kept the list anyway, she'd say later, because the alternative was assuming every clean-looking name actually was clean, and she'd spent 4 years at the port learning how easy that assumption was to weaponize. In March, a routine customs data pull crossed her desk. A commercial shipment. $41,000 in baseball equipment, aluminum bats, catcher's gear, protective padding, bound for a youth academy in Ciudad Obregón. Nothing about a baseball order should have triggered a second look. Sporting goods move across that border constantly, cheaply, and boringly. But Reyes had a habit other agents in her group used to tease her about. She cross-referenced freight manifests against a running list of customs brokers who'd appeared in prior seizure files, no matter how minor the connection. The broker on this shipment was based in Hermosillo. His name had come up before. 3 times, in fact, on cases that had nothing to do with each other on the surface: a vehicle parts seizure, a textile shipment flagged for undervaluation, and a cash structuring case that had quietly closed without charges 2 years earlier. 3 unrelated files. 1 recurring name in the paperwork nobody upstream had bothered to connect. Reyes did the arithmetic that would end up driving the entire case. 900 bats. 62 kids on a roster the Academy had filed with the Regional Youth League the year before. That's roughly 14 bats per player, in a sport where a team typically carries 2 or 3 team bats, plus whatever personal bats a handful of serious players bring themselves. It wasn't impossible on its face, Academy's stockpile equipment, but paired with a customs broker who'd already brushed against 3 other cases, it was enough to justify pulling the thread. What she found when she pulled it should have stayed a straightforward customs anomaly. It didn't. Within 2 weeks, the case stopped being about aluminum bats and started being about a name that had surfaced once before, in a 2021 wiretap application nobody had ever gotten approved. A Sinaloa faction lieutenant known in intercepted communications only by an alias, El Piloto, reportedly the man who moved fentanyl precursor money north of Culiacan and structured proceeds back south through legitimate-looking Sonoran fronts. If Reyes's instinct was right, the Academy wasn't an isolated laundering front. It was one node in something much larger, run by someone who had already beaten 1 federal attempt to build a case against him. That's the moment the story stopped being about bats. Reyes brought what she had to her supervisor, a supervisory special agent named Daniel Kwan. who'd run financial task forces along the Arizona corridor for over a decade. Kwan's first reaction, by her own account later, was skepticism. Youth sports fronts existed, everyone in the group had heard of them in passing, but they were notoriously difficult to prosecute. Charitable donations are legal. Gate receipts are legal. Proving that a specific dollar in a specific account came from fentanyl and not from a genuinely generous tire shop owner requires a level of financial reconstruction that takes months, sometimes years. And it requires Mexican authorities to cooperate on records that live entirely outside U.S. jurisdiction. Here's the take that'll probably get some pushback. The reason cases like this take years isn't bureaucratic slowness. It's that the system built to prove laundering assumes launderers hide the money badly. This one didn't. It hid the money by making it boring, small, and local. Precisely the profile financial crimes units are worst equipped to flag quickly, because flagging it means treating an entire town's small business ecosystem as suspect. Nobody wants to be the agent who accuses 34 tortillerias and tire shops of fronting for a cartel and turns out to be wrong about even one of them. Kwan approved the case anyway. 6 people initially. Reyes as lead financial analyst. 2 agents to build the Mexican side liaison relationship through DEA's Hermosillo country office. A financial forensics contractor to reconstruct 6 years of academy bookkeeping once, if they could get access to it. And 2 analysts assigned to map the broker's other shipments going back to 2019. For 3 months, that mapping effort produced almost nothing. Manifest after manifest, the broker's shipments looked exactly as clean as everything else moving through Hermosillo customs. Furniture, agricultural parts, the ordinary churn of cross-border trade. The team had a name, a hunch, and a stalled case. Then a records request to the Mexican tax authority came back with something nobody on the team had asked for directly. A secondary filing, buried in the broker's own corporate paperwork, listing a residential address in Ciudad Obregón as the registered contact for a company that didn't otherwise exist anywhere in the shipment data. The address belonged to Héctor Villalba. The Academy's director wasn't just accepting donations processed through a broker with a checkered history. He was the broker's client of record on a shell entity nobody could yet explain. Reyes remembers reading the filing twice to make sure she wasn't seeing what she wanted to see. What's most surprising about this case isn't that a cartel used a youth sports program as a front. That's a known playbook. Soccer clubs, boxing gyms, even a rodeo circuit have shown up in laundering indictments before. What's surprising is how long the Academy had been operating clean before anyone even thought to look. 6 years. 2 full generations of little leaguers came up through those diamonds, some of them genuinely talented, some of them genuinely helped by free equipment their families could never have afforded. The laundering operation and the charity weren't running side by side. They were the same organization, indistinguishable from the inside, and that's precisely what made it durable. With Villalba's name attached to the shell entity, the case shifted from a financial anomaly to a formal joint investigation. DEA's Hermosillo Liaison Office reached out to counterparts in the Fiscalía General de la República, Mexico's federal prosecutor's office, to begin coordinating on financial records that lived entirely on Mexican soil and that U.S. agents had no unilateral authority to seize. That kind of cooperation isn't automatic. It runs through formal mutual legal assistance channels, and in cases touching organized crime in Sonora, it runs through officials who know that the wrong leak at the wrong moment gets someone killed. That risk wasn't abstract. 3 months into the joint phase, the team's first real informant, a former assistant coach at the academy who'd grown uneasy about the gate receipt numbers he was asked to sign off on, stopped answering calls entirely. No message, no goodbye, just silence where there had been a weekly check-in. The agents running him spent 2 tense weeks not knowing whether he'd been made. whether he'd simply gotten scared and walked away, or whether something worse had happened. It would be over a month before they learned he'd left the state entirely on his own, terrified enough by a stray comment from Villalba about people who talk too much, that he decided disappearing quietly beat trying to explain himself to anyone. Here's what this tells us about how these networks survive as long as they do. It isn't through violence alone. It's through ordinary people, a coach, a bookkeeper, a tire shop owner, making a small, rational, self-protective decision to look away, one time, and then finding that the next time is easier. Nobody in that academy woke up planning to launder fentanyl money. Most of them, agents would later conclude, never fully understood what they were part of. They understood a banner, a sponsorship, a favor for a man who'd never given them a reason to ask questions. By early summer, the case had a name of its own inside the Tucson field office: Operation Home Plate. It also had a second target, one that would prove far harder to reach than Villalba. El Piloto, the alias behind the 2021 wiretap application that had gone nowhere, remained a ghost. No confirmed photograph, no confirmed real name in any file DEA could locate. Just a pattern of intercepted phrases from an old, expired wiretap that described a man who structured cash flows the way an accountant would, methodically, without the theatrics that usually got mid-level cartel figures caught. Reyes's team faced an uncomfortable choice that comes up in almost every long financial case. Keep building quietly toward a bigger, riskier target, or move now on what they already had and accept a smaller, guaranteed result. Quan pushed to wait. Every week of delay was a week the network kept moving proceeds, but it was also a week closer to identifying whether El Piloto was a real, chargeable individual or a compartmentalized myth the cartel used to protect whoever actually ran the finances. While the wait dragged on, the financial forensics contractors team was doing the least cinematic work in the entire investigation, and arguably the most important. 4 analysts, working out of a windowless annex office in Tucson, spent that stretch of summer physically sorting through more than 11,000 pages of academy records obtained through the Joint Liaison Channel, invoices, bank statements, tournament rosters, handwritten concession stand tallies going back 6 years. No software could do the first pass. Someone had to read every gate receipt slip and check it against a league schedule to see whether the tournament it claimed to document had actually been sanctioned, actually had a filed roster, actually had umpires paid through the regional association. It was, by the account of one analyst who worked the file, some of the most tedious labor of her career, punctuated by moments that made the hair on her arms stand up. A receipt claiming 400 paid admissions to a tournament for which the regional league had no record at all. A donation from a tortilleria dated the same week that same tortilleria's owner had, according to a separate municipal filing, reported the business closed for renovations. A bottled water plant that had supposedly donated enough money in a single quarter to cover a third of its annual reported revenue. Each discrepancy on its own was explainable. Small businesses make bookkeeping mistakes. Renovation timelines slip. But laid end to end, 11,000 pages of them, the pattern stopped looking like sloppiness and started looking like architecture. That reconstruction is what eventually let prosecutors put a number on the operation instead of a shape. It's also what nearly got destroyed twice before anyone got to use it. Before the case ever reached a warrant package, though, Reyes's team spent nearly 7 weeks doing something closer to old-fashioned surveillance than financial forensics. Working through the Hermosillo liaison office, Mexican federal analysts quietly logged Villalba's movements. Not a wiretap, nothing that required a court order on either side of the border, just a pattern of who visited the academy office trailer behind the third base dugout and when. A courier on a motorbike who showed up every second Friday, always around 4 in the afternoon, always leaving within 6 minutes. A sedan with Sonora plates that parked 2 blocks away, never closer, on days when the academy reported its largest gate receipts. Villalba himself made a bank deposit in person, at the same branch, on the same day of the month, for 31 consecutive months before the surveillance log started, a pattern rigid enough that one analyst described it as the least criminal-looking criminal behavior I've ever logged. It was that rigidity, more than any single transaction, that convinced Quan the operation was worth the resources it was about to cost. Loop until count doesn't quite describe how the surveillance team worked, but the instinct was the same. They weren't looking for one damning moment. They were counting repetitions until the pattern itself became the evidence. 6 months of a courier showing up every second Friday isn't proof of anything on its own. 6 months of it lining up almost to the hour, with reported spikes in gate receipts that had no corresponding tournament on any sanctioned schedule, that's a rhythm a defense attorney has a much harder time explaining away as coincidence. The break came from the one place nobody had been watching closely enough: the tryouts. Every year, a handful of the academy's better players got sent across the border to open scouting tryouts in Arizona. Legitimate events, run by legitimate scouts, no different from thousands of similar tryouts that happen every summer in border towns. What agents hadn't clocked, until an analyst cross-referenced border crossing records against the academy's own travel manifests, was that the players selected for these trips weren't always the best players on the roster. In at least 4 instances over 3 years, a player with mediocre stats got a tryout slot over a teammate with a far stronger season. And in every one of those 4 cases, the selected player's family included an adult male with a prior, minor, non-violent conviction that had since been cleared or expunged. The tryouts weren't just tryouts. They were a testing mechanism, a way to learn, safely and repeatedly, which teenage boys with which family backgrounds could cross the Nogales port of entry, get checked, and come back without triggering so much as a secondary inspection. A dry run for a courier pipeline that hadn't been activated yet, or had only just begun to be. That detail is the layered loop underneath everything else in this case. The money answered one question: how does the cartel move proceeds without anyone noticing? The tryouts answered a second, darker question nobody had thought to ask yet. How do you build, years in advance, a bench of couriers nobody would ever suspect? Put yourself in Reyes's position for a second, staring at that cross-reference late on a Thursday. You've spent months proving a charity as a laundering front. That's already a hard case. Now you're looking at data suggesting the same organization has spent years quietly auditioning teenagers, kids who trust the coach, who want nothing more than a shot at a tryout for a role they don't know exists yet. The money case and the courier case are the same case, and you don't yet know if the courier pipeline is active or still in its testing phase. The team escalated. What had been a financial crimes case with a narcotics trafficking dimension became a joint operation involving DEA's Tucson Field Division, the Arizona-based HSI liaison for cross-border child exploitation and trafficking concerns, because a scheme built around minors, even one not yet activated for smuggling, triggers that review as a matter of policy, and continued coordination with Mexican federal prosecutors on the Villalba financial thread. Unpopular opinion, and it's one worth sitting with. Whatever sentence Villalba eventually received for the financial charges, it will almost certainly undercount what he actually did to those kids. Laundering statutes measure dollars. They don't have a line item for grooming a 14-year-old's trust in a coach and quietly testing whether his little brother could carry 10 kilos across a port of entry someday. The financial case is the one prosecutors can prove cleanly. It isn't the one that matters most. What do you think? Does a laundering conviction even come close to accounting for what a scheme like this actually does to a community that trusted it? Sit with that for a second, because there isn't a clean answer, and the case file certainly doesn't offer one. Through late summer, the investigation moved into its most delicate phase, building a criminal case against Villalba solid enough to support search warrants, while keeping the broader courier pipeline question and the identity of El Piloto from tipping anyone off before agents were ready to move. That balance nearly broke twice. The first near miss came from inside DEA's own financial forensics contract. The outside firm reconstructing 6 years of academy bookkeeping suffered a server failure in August that wiped 3 weeks of reconciled data that hadn't yet been backed up to the case management system because the reconciliation was still in a draft state. It wasn't sabotage. It was an ordinary hard drive failure at the worst possible moment, and it cost the team most of a month rebuilding work they'd already finished once. The lead analyst on the reconstruction later described rereading the same 11,000 pages a second time as one of the lowest points of the entire case. Not because the work was hard, but because everyone on the team understood exactly how close they'd come to losing weeks they didn't have to spare. The second near miss was worse. In September, a routine records request to a Sonoran state agency, filed through proper liaison channels, nothing improper about it, appears to have been the source of a leak. Weeks later, agents learned through a secondary source that Villalba had abruptly restructured 2 of the shell vendor accounts, closing one tortilleria's business account entirely and opening a new one under a cousin's name. It wasn't proof he knew he was under federal investigation. It could have been ordinary paranoia or ordinary Mexican small business churn. But it was enough to make Quan accelerate the timeline by nearly 6 weeks, moving up a warrant package that wasn't fully ready. That's the wall every long financial case eventually hits. The moment you have to decide whether to move on evidence that's 90% complete, because waiting for the last 10% might mean losing the case entirely. We won't spoil how that call played out just yet, but if you've ever had to decide between a plan that's ready and a plan that's running out of time, you already know how that pressure feels. By October, the Joint Task Force had assembled enough to act. U.S. prosecutors in Arizona, working with Mexican federal counterparts, secured coordinated authority. Search and seizure warrants on the Academy's financial records and offices in Ciudad Obregón, executed by Mexican federal authorities with DEA agents present in an advisory capacity, and parallel financial seizure orders in the United States targeting accounts linked to the equipment purchases and wire transfers Reyes had first flagged back in the spring. Here's the piece that made this operation different from a typical cartel front raid. There was no door to kick down at 4 a.m., no stash house, no rifles stacked against a wall. The entire operative center of this laundering network was a baseball field with a snack bar. Executing a raid on a children's sports facility with players and families who had no idea what they were part of required a level of care most cartel takedowns don't. Agents timed the operation for a Tuesday morning in October, deliberately outside of any scheduled practice or tournament, specifically so that no child would be present when federal agents walked through the gates. The operational plan itself reflected that caution at every level. Mexican federal officers staged 2 blocks away in unmarked vehicles rather than parking anywhere visible from the field, waiting until a groundskeeper confirmed the gates were unlocked and the office trailer behind the third base dugout was occupied only by Villalba and a part-time bookkeeper. There was no perimeter to breach, no armed resistance anticipated or encountered. The most dramatic moment of the entire seizure, according to one agent present, was a filing cabinet drawer that stuck and had to be pried open with a crowbar borrowed from the equipment shed, the same shed that had, for 6 years, stored bats bought with fentanyl money. The bookkeeper, A woman in her 50s, named in the Mexican court record only by her initials, was not arrested that morning. Agents present described her reaction as somewhere between confusion and relief. She asked almost immediately whether this meant she could finally stop lying to her sister about where the Academy's tournament numbers actually came from. In a follow-up interview 2 days later, conducted voluntarily at a federal office in Hermosillo with her own attorney present, she told investigators she'd flagged the gate receipt discrepancies to Villalba herself more than once in her second year on the job. He'd told her, she said, that the numbers were adjusted for community goodwill and that she shouldn't worry about matching them to actual attendance. She kept working there for 4 more years after that conversation. When asked why, she said the pay was steady, her son had asthma, and the Academy's health stipend covered his inhalers, and she'd told herself every year that she'd start looking for another job once the season ended. She was never charged. Prosecutors determined she lacked the knowledge or intent the statute required, though her voluntary cooperation, including 3 years of parallel personal notes she'd kept without telling anyone, became one of the more useful pieces of corroborating evidence in the eventual case against Villalba. The financial records seized that morning confirmed what Reyes's spreadsheet had suggested since March. 6 years of layered transactions running through 34 front businesses, fabricated gate receipts totaling, once forensic accountants finished the reconstruction, a substantial share of the $390 million investigators ultimately attributed to the network's laundering activity across its full operational history, moving cartel proceeds from fentanyl sales in the United States back into Sonoran real estate, vehicle purchases, and reinvestment into the shell vendor businesses themselves. Villalba was taken into custody by Mexican federal authorities that same morning at his home without incident. He did not resist. Agents who were present described him as almost relieved, a man, one agent later said, who seemed to have been waiting for this exact morning for longer than anyone realized. The Hermosillo customs broker was arrested separately, within hours, based on the financial trail Reyes had first pulled on that March records request. His cooperation, once it began, filled in gaps the documentary evidence alone couldn't close, including, finally, a name for El Piloto. That cooperation didn't come easily or quickly. By the account of agents who sat in on the early sessions, the broker spent the better part of 2 days insisting he was nothing more than a paperwork specialist, a man who filed manifests for whoever paid his invoice, with no obligation and no particular interest in what his clients actually shipped. It was a plausible story, and for a customs broker, it's often even true. What changed his posture, according to one agent's later account, wasn't a threat. It was a single printed page laid on the table, the secondary corporate filing linking his own shell entity to Villalba's residential address, the same filing Reyes had read twice back in the spring to make sure she wasn't imagining it. Confronted with his own signature on paperwork he'd have to explain independently of anything Villalba said, the broker's account began to shift. He asked, before anything else, whether his teenage daughter, who had, unbeknownst to him at the time, briefly dated one of the Academy's former players, was in any danger. Agents told him honestly that they didn't know, and that the answer depended in part on how forthcoming he was in the next 10 minutes. He talked for 6 hours straight after that. He wasn't a myth. He also wasn't the towering cartel figure the 2021 wiretap application had implied. According to the broker's cooperation and subsequent financial reconstruction, El Piloto was a mid-level logistics coordinator for a Sinaloa faction operating out of the Yaqui Valley corridor. Someone whose entire value to the organization was that he was forgettable. No flash, no public profile. A man who structured hundreds of millions of dollars without ever once drawing the kind of attention that gets a trafficker's face on a wanted poster. He was taken into custody by Mexican authorities roughly 3 weeks after Villalba, following a financial trail that led investigators to a property outside Hermosillo, registered, like the Academy's original shell vendor, under a relative's name. According to the broker, El Piloto had never once set foot on either diamond at the Academy. He communicated with Villalba almost exclusively through a rotating set of intermediaries, none of whom used the same phone twice for more than a few weeks, and he reviewed the Academy's laundering numbers the way a regional franchise owner might review quarterly sales reports, a spreadsheet, a handful of questions about which fronts were underperforming, and nothing that ever referenced drugs, minors, or violence in language a wiretap could use against him. The broker described him as unnervingly calm in every interaction, a man whose worst moments of visible frustration were reserved not for missed payments, but for sloppy paperwork. The courier pipeline question, how far the tryout testing scheme had actually progressed toward moving people, not just money, turned out to be the case's most unsettling answer. Investigators confirmed the pattern was real. 4 documented instances of tryout selection correlating with family criminal history clearances. But they found no evidence the pipeline had yet been activated to move contraband or people across the border. It had been built. It had been tested. It hadn't yet been used. Whether that's reassuring or just means agents caught it in time is a question the case file doesn't really answer, and honestly, neither can we. In the aftermath, U.S. and Mexican prosecutors pursued parallel cases. In the United States, forfeiture actions targeted assets tied to the equipment purchases and wire transfers that had crossed U.S. financial institutions, the beginning thread Reyes pulled that March. In Mexico, Villalba and the customs broker faced organized crime and money laundering charges under Mexican federal law, with the case built substantially on the financial reconstruction DEA's Tucson group had assembled and shared through formal liaison channels. El Piloto's case remained, as of the most recent public court filings, still working through Mexican federal proceedings, a reminder that cases like this rarely close in a single headline moment. The Academy itself closed. Sonoran youth sports officials moved quickly to fold its remaining registered players into other regional programs, wary of leaving dozens of teenagers without a season and without answers about why their coaches had suddenly disappeared. Most of those kids, by every account agents could later gather, had no idea what they'd actually been part of. They just knew the free bats stopped coming, and nobody explained why. Marisol's son was one of them. He finished that season on a different team, in borrowed cleats, on a field with no scoreboard. She says he still doesn't know the full story of why the Academy closed, and she hasn't decided whether or when to tell him. He remembers it, she says, as the year the good coach just stopped showing up. That's maybe the coldest part of this whole case. A financial engine and a courier testing operation ran for 6 years inside something that, for the kids playing on it, was just baseball. Free gloves, a shot at a tryout, a coach who showed up to every game. The last people anyone thought to ask what they knew were the only ones who never should have been asked anything at all. We'll say what most people covering cases like this won't. The real failure here isn't that a cartel found a clever front. Cartels have always found clever fronts. The failure is structural. Financial crimes units are chronically under-resourced relative to how much of this money moves through exactly this kind of small, boring, community-facing laundering. And it took one analyst's personal habit of manually cross-referencing customs brokers, on her own initiative, to catch what 6 years of ordinary compliance checks never flagged. That shouldn't be how these cases get made. Reyes, for her part, has said in the limited public commentary she's given since that she doesn't think of herself as having done anything unusual. She just kept pulling a thread that wouldn't stop feeling wrong. Sometimes that's the entire difference between a case that gets made and one that doesn't. Not brilliance, just refusal to let an inconsistency go unexplained. If you've made it this far, You already know the ending isn't as clean as a raid montage would suggest. The money is being clawed back slowly, case by case, through forfeiture proceedings that will likely take years. The courier pipeline was disrupted before it was activated, but investigators openly admit they can't be certain it was the only one of its kind operating in the region. And the kids who played on those 2 diamonds are now scattered across other academies, most of them still not fully aware of what they were standing on. We cut a few of the finer financial reconstruction details from this video for length. The actual wire routing chain through 3 Sonoran banks is its own rabbit hole. Comment more if you want a deeper breakdown of how the laundering math actually worked, because it's genuinely one of the more inventive structuring methods we've come across in this channel's run. For now, Operation Home Plate stands as one more entry in a growing pattern investigators are watching closely across the border region. Legitimate-looking community institutions, quietly repurposed, hiding in plain sight because nobody wants to be the one who accuses a beloved youth program of being something else. The next one won't announce itself either. That's the entire point. If this case pulled you in, we've covered similar financial front networks before. An avocado export operation, a shrimp fleet, a grocery chain receipt trail that unraveled a network worth hundreds of millions. The pattern keeps repeating because it keeps working, until someone like Elena Reyes decides a number in a spreadsheet doesn't add up and refuses to stop asking why. Subscribe if you want to keep following where these threads lead. There's always another invoice that doesn't add up.